When you talk about the history of a state, one of the first questions you need to ask yourself is if you're talking about the physical location or how the people who currently live there got there. If you're talking about the people who currently live in Utah, you don't start in the state of Utah. You start in upstate New York during the Second Great Awakening. The building of the Erie Canal in the early 1800s had brought a large number of people from different places and Christian denominations to the same general area where few established churches existed. In this atmosphere, there was opportunity for more fringe Christian sects to grow and flourish. One such group was known as the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, more commonly known as the Shakers. The Shaker religion had been around since the 1740s, but much of the basis of the church came from the time when Mother Ann Lee joined and became their leader around 1758. She encouraged members of the community to abandon all worldly possessions and live communally, forsaking marriage and living celibate lives. She said, quote, "I saw in vision the Lord Jesus in his kingdom and glory. He revealed to me the depths of man's loss, what it was, and the way of redemption therefrom. Then I was able to bear an open testimony against the sin that is the root of all evil, and I felt the power of God flow into my soul like a fountain of living water. From that day I have been able to take up a full cross against all doleful works of the flesh." They were called the Shakers as part of their worship involved dancing and shouting that often appeared as if the members of the congregation were shaking uncontrollably. Mother Lee and 8 of her followers came to America in 1774 and established their first commune just north of Albany. It was there that Mother Lee proclaimed she had a vision where, quote, "I saw a large tree, every leaf of which shone with such brightness as made appear like a burning torch, representing the Church of Christ, which will yet be established in this land." On her death, her followers determined that she was the second coming of Christ in female form. The Shakers believed in gender equality, communal living, and pacifism, and in many ways their core beliefs were very similar to the Quakers of Pennsylvania. In Shaker communes, everything was shared, but everyone who was able to was also expected to work. But the church's position on celibacy was quite different, viewing sex, even for procreation, as a sin. This creates an obvious problem of growing the church through new children. The only way to continue to add youth was through adoption of unwanted or orphan children, and often states would use the Shakers specifically for this purpose. These children would be raised communally and could choose to stay or leave once they reached their 21st birthday. But when laws changed and they were no longer sending orphan children to them, communities began to disappear. Still, between 1800 and 1900, over 20,000 people converted. Upstate New York was also a place where entirely new groups of Christians could emerge in ways not possible in areas that had long-standing church traditions. While during the Great Awakening, traveling preachers and evangelist groups coming to town was not uncommon anywhere in the country, it took hold in a very different way in upstate New York. A popular revival teacher by the name of Charles Grandison Finney wrote of his experience preaching there by saying, quote, "I found that region of country what the Western phrase would be called a burnt district. There had been a few years previously a wild excitement passing through that region, which they called a revival of religion, which turned out to be spurious. It was reported as having been a very extravagant excitement and resulted in a reaction so extensive and profound as to leave the impression on many minds that religion was a mere delusion. A great many men seemed to be settled in that conviction, taking what they had seen as specimens of a revival of religion. They felt justified in opposing anything looking toward the promoting of a revival." A man by the name of John Humphrey Noyes saw Finney preach in 1831 when he was a 20-year-old law student. He wrote of the experience, quote, "My heart was fixed on the millennium, and I resolved to live or die for it." Noyes graduated, but rather than practice law, he decided to enroll in a theological seminary to become a minister in 1832. And through his study of the Bible, he became convinced that the second coming of Christ had already occurred in 70 AD, and that since that time, quote, "mankind was now living in a new age." He also came to believe he had surrendered his will to God so completely that his impulses, quote, "came from a perfect heart." And because of this, he believed that if his will was in conflict with the church, then, quote, "his new relationship to God canceled out his obligation to obey traditional moral standards or the normal laws of society." While enrolled at Yale Seminary, he made declarations that caused outrages at the college. His newly earned license to preach was revoked by the school in 1834. He responded by saying, quote, "I took away their license to sin, and they go on sinning. They have taken away my license to preach, but I shall go on preaching." When Noyes left the college, he went to Vermont and started a religious commune, practicing what he called, quote, "complex marriage." Under this system, everyone in the commune was married to each other, but men and women were expected to share sexual partners communally. He argued this was based on a passage in the Bible by Paul, where he said that there was no marriage in heaven. and so there shouldn't be on Earth either, he argued, but that didn't mean no sex. He proposed a distinction between sex for procreation and sex for what would be called amative purposes, similar to other social exchanges, also a spiritual experience. And to avoid unintentional impregnation, men of the community practiced what Noyes called male continence, where the male partner avoided ejaculation. Noyes also condemned masturbation, as he believed ejaculation without procreative purposes was wasteful. When some raised medical concerns, Noyes wrote, quote, "In regard to the injurious effect of male continence, which has been anticipated and often predicted, the community has to report, in general, that they have not been realized. For example, it is seriously believed by some that nature requires a periodical and somewhat frequent discharge of the seed, and that the retention is liable to be injurious. Even if this were true, it would be no argument against male continence, but rather an argument in favor of masturbation, for it is obvious that before marriage men have no lawful method of discharge but masturbation, and after marriage it's foolish and cruel to expend one's seed on a wife merely for the sake of getting rid of it, as it would be to fire a gun at one's best friend merely for the sake of unloading it." He wrote that most people's experience with sex is, quote, "a momentary affair, terminating in exhaustion and disgust. If it begins in the spirit, it soon ends in the flesh, i.e., the amative, which is spiritual, is drowned in the propagative, which is sensual. The exhaustion which follows naturally breeds self-reproach and shame, and this leads to dislike and the concealment of sexual organs, which contract disagreement associations from the fact that they are instruments of pernicious excess. This undoubtedly is the philosophy of the origin of shame after the fall. Adam and Eve first sunk the spiritual and the sensual, in eating forbidden fruit, and then, having lost the true balance of their natures, they sunk the spiritual and the sensual in the intercourse with each other, by pushing prematurely beyond the amative into the propagative, and so became ashamed, and began to look with an evil eye on the instrument of their folly." On November 26, 1847, Noyes was arrested for adultery, and shortly after the entire community moved to Oneida, New York, where they set up another commune, which lasted for over 30 years. Male children born into the commune were given, quote, "mentors" when they were reached the age of 14. These were usually postmenopausal women who were able to teach the boys male continence techniques while still avoiding pregnancy. All children are in fact raised communally by committee. They were separated from their biological parents usually around the age of 1 after weaning and monitored to assure that the children didn't form a specific bond to their biological parents rather than the community as a whole. By the late 1860s, Noyes and his followers had begun setting up committees who decided who could and could not conceive. Records indicated that 58 children were allowed to be conceived by the committee, 9 by Noyes himself. Everyone in the community was required to work, and in fact, they created the Oneida Silverware Company, which is still to this day one of the largest world manufacturers of silverware. In June of 1879, Noyes was told that he was about to be arrested for statutory rape, and fled the commune and the country, moving to Canada. While there, he wrote to the commune encouraging them to dissolve and adopt more traditional lives. The commune dissolved in 1881, converting the business side into the Oneida Limited Silverware Company. And there were more examples. While Noyes was listening to Finney in 1831 and becoming inspired, another gentleman by the name of William Miller announced, quote, "I believe that the second coming of Jesus Christ is near, even at the door, even within 21 years, on or before 1843. Miller was a wealthy farmer and a Baptist preacher. He claimed he had calculated the dates based on calculations around the prophecy of Daniel in the Bible, specifically Daniel 8:12. His followers began to be called Millerites, and he was called to give a more specific date and time. The closest Miller personally got was saying, quote, "My principles in brief are that Jesus Christ will come again to this earth, cleanse, purify, and take possession of the same, with all the saints, sometime between March 21st, 1843, and March 21st, 1844. He went on to say, quote, "If Christ comes as we expect, we will sing the song of victory soon. If not, we will watch and pray and preach until he comes, for soon our time and all prophetic days will have been filled." By April of 1843, around 600,000 copies of Miller's prophecies were being published and distributed nationally. When March of 1844 came and went, some adopted a new date of April 18th, 1844, based on a teaching from a Jewish calendar. When April 18th came and went, it was argued there could be, quote, "tarrying time," which moved the coming off by a few months. By May of 1844, it was reported over 5 million copies of the so-called Millerite publications had been distributed. In August of 1844, a group of believers met, and a man by the name of Samuel Snow presented a complex calculation he had done that gave a specific date, October 22nd, 1844. When October 22nd, 1844 came, most agreed Jesus did not. But a small minority of the Millerite community held firm that something had happened. It had just not been fully understood. In 1845, 61 delegates met to discuss where the Millerites would go from the future, and from this 4 groups emerged, one of which would become the Seventh-day Adventists, which now has nearly 100,000 churches with over 22 million members. But they were still only the second largest religious movement to emerge from upstate New York during the Second Great Awakening. The largest, of course, being the Church of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormons. Joseph Smith was born in Vermont, but his family moved to upstate New York in 1816 when he was about 9 years old. Smith would later write that during this time he was exposed to many completing ideologies, including what would come to be known religiously as folk magic, which was a common practice in the area. He said that his first vision occurred sometime around 1820, when he was about 15 years old, and it told him all of the contemporary churches had, quote, turned aside from the gospel. It was 3 years later in 1823 that he said he was visited first by the angel Moroni, who revealed the location of a buried book made of golden plates, as well as a number of other artifacts near his family home in Manchester, New York. But, he said, he was unable to retrieve them at that time. He said he returned to visit each year until he was finally able to obtain the plates on his 4th visit in 1827. During these 4 years, it appeared that Smith's family was in financial distress following the death of his brother Alvin. Smith, like some of the other family members, worked at least part-time using an object known as a seer stone to locate buried treasure. It's likely he received some sort of payment from a wealthy farmer by the name of Joseph Stowell, as he was charged by the courts by Stowell's relatives on a variation of fraud called glass-looking. Glass-looking was, as near as we can tell, pretending to locate lost treasure. The outcome of that trial was unclear as the court records have been lost. In January of 1827, Smith eloped with a woman by the name of Emma Hale against her father's wishes. Hale's father believed that Smith had no financial future, and Smith had to promise to abandon treasure hunting in order for Emma's father to allow him to move in with them. Smith reportedly made one final trip to the hill that the angel Moroni had indicated had the golden plates, and he was able to find them. These plates, according to Smith, contained the Book of Mormon, written in a language he referred to as, quote, Reformed Egyptian. After he made this announcement, Smith's former treasure hunting associates believed he had double-crossed them and ransacked his home. As a result, Smith and his wife moved from their home in Palmyra, New York, to Harmony, New York, with the help of a neighbor by the name of Martin Harris, who had also become one of Joseph Smith's scribes. Harris reportedly worked with Smith to transcribe the first draft of the Book of Mormon, but that book was lost, and according to Smith, Moroni took back the plates as punishment, keeping them for nearly a year. In September of 1828, Smith says Moroni returned and allowed him to dictate again to his wife Emma. And in April, a man by the name of Oliver Chowdhury, who had also worked as a treasure hunter prior, became a scribe for Smith. By July 1st, 1829, Smith reported he had dictated everything from the plates, and that the angel Moroni had taken them back. What Smith dictated from these plates became the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon was first advertised for sale on March 26, 1830, and about 2 weeks later, the first Mormon church was founded, calling themselves the Church of Christ. But in upstate New York, many remembered Smith's prior glass-looking trials and were suspicious of him and his new church. Smith was arrested and charged with being, quote, a disorderly person. And although he was acquitted, he and his followers were looking for a place to relocate based on Smith's visions of, quote, New Jerusalem. Smith reportedly believed that New Jerusalem was on the borders of the then United States of America, in areas of the country that were controlled by Native Americans in the West. Smith sent Oliver Chowdhury out of New York to the west to locate the site, and while Chowdhury was out looking for New Jerusalem, he was instructed to convert Native Americans he might encounter there. Smith said these Native Americans might be what the Book of Mormon called Lamanites. The first edition of Book of Mormon title page stated that it was, quote, written to the Lamanites, which are a remnant of the house of Israel. He said that these would be descendants of a lost tribe of Israel that he believed came to North America by boat around 600 BC, and that they would partner with the Mormons in building Zion, which he believed would be a peaceful and pure society where people would be, quote, pure of heart. Chowdhury was traveling from New York toward Missouri when he met a man by the name of Sidney Rigdon in Ohio. Rigdon was a Campbellite restorationist preacher, a sect who believed that much of the teachings of Christ were lost or corrupted in the years following his death. He had become disaffected from the Baptist Church, and on reading of the Book of Mormon, he was convinced to convert. Rigdon was baptized in November of 1830, and following his conversion, he was able to convince hundreds of his congregants to also join the new Mormon Church of Christ. Rigdon traveled to New York to meet Smith, And hearing news of the new congregation and facing opposition in New York, Smith announced that it had been revealed to him that he and his followers should gather in Kirtland, Ohio, where Rigdon was from. During this transitional time, when the congregation moved from New York toward Ohio, some of the church members, including Cowdery and Rigdon, claimed to also have visions and revelations that were separate from Smith's. Smith then stated that only he had the ability to have true revelations and declare church doctrine and scripture. Specifically, regarding Rigdon's visions, Smith in August of 1831 announced, quote, "And now behold, verily I say unto you, I, the Lord, am not pleased with my servant Sidney Rigdon. He exalted himself in his heart, and received not counsel, but grieved the Spirit. Wherefore his writing is not acceptable unto the Lord, and he shall make another. And if the Lord receive it not, behold, he standeth no longer in the office to which I have appointed him." But this falling out with Rigdon did not end his time at the church. In fact, Joseph Smith coordinated with Rigdon on a retranslation of the Bible that came to be known as the Joseph Smith translation. Smith also encouraged Cowdery to continue his search for the Holy City in the West. Cowdery claimed to have located the city in Missouri, and after visiting in July of 1831, Smith agreed and declared that Jackson City, Missouri was the holy site and, quote, centerpiece of Zion. But Smith and his followers were not always welcomed. In Ohio in 1832, a mob reportedly tarred and feathered Smith and Rigdon, beating them unconscious and leaving them for dead. Smith wrote of Rigdon's injuries, quote, "The next morning I went to see Elder Rigdon and found him crazy, and his head highly inflamed, for they dragged him by his heels, and those, too, so high from the earth he could not raise his head from the rough frozen surface, which lacerated it exceedingly. And when he saw me, he called to his wife to bring him his razor. She asked him what he wanted of it, and he replied, to kill me. Sister Rigdon left the room, and he asked me to bring his razor. I asked him what he wanted of it, and he replied he wanted to kill his wife, and he continued delirious for some days." But things were even worse in Missouri. In July of 1833, Jackson City's non-Mormon population forcibly evicted the majority of the Mormons living there, destroying their property, and in the process killing at least one Mormon, as they sought to evict all of the Latter-day Saints from Jackson City, Missouri. In spite of all these setbacks, by the summer of 1835, there were between 1,500 and 2,000 converts in the Ohio community. In March of 1836, a temple was built in Kirtland, Ohio, and in January of 1837, Smith and his followers formed a company that operated similarly to a bank, calling itself the Kirtland Safety Society. The bank was run by Cowdery and issued banknotes ostensibly backed by real estate investments. But the bank failed almost immediately. Smith and his supporters found themselves deep in debt, and Smith was charged with fraud. Joseph Smith was no longer safe in Ohio with these charges. They decided to leave for Missouri, but they knew they could not go back to Jackson City, and instead decided to form a settlement in western Missouri that they called Far West. It was at this point that the church changed its name formally and became the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. When followers came to join him in Far West, once again locals in the area felt threatened and tensions escalated. But unlike in Jackson, where Smith had told his followers to be patient and not retaliate against the violence, Smith encouraged his followers to stand their ground. A man by the name of William Penniston was running for the Missouri State Senate legislature, and he called the Mormons, quote, horse thieves and robbers, and he warned them not to try and vote in the 1838 election. He told his supporters, quote, suffer such men as these to vote, and you'll soon lose your suffrage. When about 30 members of Smith's church came to vote, a man by the name of Dick Weldon told them they were not allowed to vote, quote, no more than Negroes. A brawl ensued, which the Mormons won, but this did not end the conflict. When a Mormon settler bought land at an important river intersection in the town of DeWitt, members of the church had begun to settle in the area. Groups opposed to the Mormons began to take up arms, with one Mormon reporting over 100 men led by Colonel William Cloud Jones took him prisoner for over 2 hours. In a separate incident, a Mormon reported that a group of 14 men came to his home, and he said, I was compelled to leave my home. My house was thronged with a company of armed men consisting of 14 in number, and they abused my family in almost every form that creatures in the shape of human beings could invent. They were reportedly held hostage for about 14 days before a group of Mormons came to their rescue, but by then one of his children had died, and his wife and another child died soon after. On September 20th, 1838, a group of roughly 150 armed men came to DeWitt and gave the Mormons 10 days to vacate. If they did not vacate, they would, quote, exterminate them without regard to age or sex. The Mormons sent appeals to state and local officials but got no response. On October 1st, the group returned and burned down the homes and stable of one Mormon settler as they surrounded the rest of the town. On October 6th, the county militia was sent to disperse the group. But not only did the group refuse to disperse, some of the members of the militia threatened to join the attackers if they were asked to disperse it, causing the leader of the militia to withdraw and send a request to aid from the governor. On October 9th, the governor's response came. He said, quote, "It was a quarrel between the Mormons and the mob, and that they should fight it out." On October 11th, Mormon leaders agreed to abandon the settlement in DeWitt, with 2 women dying on the first night of the evacuation. On October 18th, Mormons of the Caldwell militia began to move toward Daviess County, where the brawl had taken place in retaliation. They plundered property, burned stores, and houses to the ground. The county seat where the brawl had taken place was reportedly, quote, "completely gutted, with only one store left untouched." One account stated, "We could stand at our door and see houses burning every night for over 2 weeks. The Mormons completely gutted Daviess County. There was scarcely a Missourian home left standing in the county. Nearly everyone was burned." Some Mormons were troubled by the retaliation. One Mormon leader wrote, quote, "The love of pillage grew upon them very fast, for they had plundered every kind of property they could get hold of." The Missouri State Militia was called out, and it fought the Mormon militia on October 24th at what became to be known as the Battle of Crooked River. The Mormons were able to drive off the militia, apparently charging them while shouting, "God and liberty." When news got to the governor of Missouri, he mustered 2,500 men to put down the Mormons, issuing an executive order on October 27th, which he stated, quote, "The Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for the public peace." Likely before the governor's order even reached the area, on October 30th, a large group of anti-Mormon vigilantes attacked settlements near Hawes Mill, killing at least 17, including a 10-year-old who was found hiding. The killer reportedly justified the murder by saying, quote, "Nits will make lice, and if he had lived, he would have become a Mormon." No one was ever prosecuted for these killings. Mormons found themselves surrounded by the state militia, and Joseph Smith reportedly was willing to accept a treaty on, quote, "any terms short of battle." The leader of the Missouri militia, General Clark, realized he had all the leverage and ordered them to give up their leaders for trial and surrender all weapons. He further ordered that anyone who had taken up arms was to sell their property to pay for damages and leave the state. Ebenezer Robinson's account of what happened stated, quote, "General Clark made the following speech to the brethren on the public square. The orders of the governor to me were that you should be exterminated and not allowed to remain in the state. And had your leaders not been given up and the terms of the treaty been complied with, before this you and your family would have been destroyed and your houses in ashes." Once the Mormon militia was disarmed, Brigham Young's report was that, quote, "they commenced their ravages by plundering the citizens of their bedding, clothing, money, wearing apparel, and everything of value they could lay their hands upon, and also attempting to violate the chastity of women in the sight of their husbands and friends, under the pretense of hunting for prisoners and arms. The soldiers sought down our oxen, cows, hogs, and fowls, at our own doors taking part away and leaving the rest to rot in the streets. The soldiers also turned their horses into our fields of corn." On November 1st, General Samuel D. Lucas held a court-martial hearing and issued the following order to General Alexander Danifin. Quote, "You will take Joseph Smith and the other prisoners into the public square far west and shoot them at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." Doniphan refused, replying, quote, "It is cold-blooded murder. I will not obey your order. My brigade shall march for liberty tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, and if you execute those men, I will hold you responsible at an earthly tribunal, so help me God." A court inquiry began on November 12th, and all but a few of the Mormons were released, but Joseph Smith was not released. On April 6th, 1839, Smith was able to escape custody and fled Missouri to Illinois, where a group had settled into a land that would become known as Nauvoo. Smith had sent 12 missionaries to England, and they were able to recruit a large number of people to come live in the new settlement. In 1841, Smith was able to negotiate an official charter for the city with the state of Illinois, which gave the city a great deal of autonomy, including the right to form a military force. This was likely because Nauvoo was located in a swamp. Malaria outbreaks were common, and it was very difficult to survive there. During this time, Smith dictated another book, purportedly from Egyptian scrolls. This book became the Book of Abraham, which also included a number of new doctrines for the church. It was also during this time that Smith began practicing plural marriage. In April of 1841, Smith secretly took his first plural wife, Louisa Beeman. Over the next 2.5 years, some believe he may have married as many as 30 other women. 10 of these women were already married, and 2 were only 14 years of age. Smith and his wife denied this was happening publicly, but behind the scenes the evidence was overwhelming. Smith was also still technically a fugitive from Missouri, and after an attempted assassination attempt on the former governor of Missouri, which some believe Smith prophesied, Illinois authorities agreed that Smith was a threat. On June 17, 1843, the governors of Illinois and Missouri issued joint arrest warrants for Smith on the grounds of treason. On June 23rd, he was arrested covertly by two men disguised as Mormon elders. On hearing of Joseph Smith's arrest, on June 24th, the Nauvoo City Council invoked martial law. On June 25th, Smith sent a letter calling for the Nauvoo militia to be raised to prevent, quote, being kidnapped into Missouri. On June 27th, the men transporting Smith were surrounded by Nauvoo militiamen. Smith reportedly told his jailers, I'm not going to Missouri this time, these are my boys, and Smith was able to return to Nauvoo. In December of 1843, Smith petitioned Congress to make Nauvoo a free territory and announced his own presidential candidacy. In March of 1844, he organized a council and proposed what he described as a theo-democracy be created, which would be more or less a shadow government where he would be the head of state. But dissent began to appear from within, the most notable coming from a man by the name of William Law. Law had been a close advisor to Smith. Law purchased a printing press and published the Nauvoo Expositor. Only one edition was ever published, but it was explosive. On June 7, 1844, Law published affidavits that Smith had, quote, authorized certain men to have more wives than one at a time. The paper stated that while the publishers of the paper did continue to believe in, quote, the religion of the Latter-day Saints as originally taught by Joseph Smith, that a schism had emerged over the many of the new teachings, and that, quote, many items of doctrine as now taught, some of which, however, are taught secretly and denied openly, further stating that, quote, false and damnable doctrines into the church, such as the plurality of gods above God in this universe, and the liability to fall with his creations, the plurality of wives for time and eternity, the doctrine of unconditional sealing up eternal lives against all crimes except that of shedding innocent blood. The following day, Smith had the printing press destroyed. Additional arrest warrants were put out for Smith, but because of the control he was given, he was initially able to have them quashed by Nauvoo courts. He declared martial law on June 18th and called out the 5,000-strong Nauvoo military force. On June 22nd, the governor of Illinois wrote to the mayor and city council of Nauvoo the following, quote, I now express to you my opinion that your conduct in the destruction of the press was a very gross outrage upon the laws and liberties of the people. It may have been full of libels, but this does not authorize you to destroy it. There are many newspapers in the state which have wrongfully abusing me for more than a year, and yet it is my regard of liberty of the press and the rights of the free people of the Republican government that I would shed the last drop of my blood to protect those presses from any illegal violence. On June 23rd, authorities entered Nauvoo to arrest Smith, but were unable to locate him. On June 25th, Smith and 16 co-defendants surrendered themselves and were held in Carthage, Illinois. On the morning of June 25th, a man by the name of Cyrus Wheelock smuggled a gun into the jail and gave it to Joseph Smith. That afternoon, a mob approached the jail. One of the jailers later wrote that they told Smith to warn him, and he responded, Don't trouble yourself, they've come to rescue me. But they were not there to rescue Smith or his companions. As the mob entered the area where Smith and his companions were confined and attempted to pull them out to do them harm, Smith tried to defend himself with a pistol. He was able to make his way to a window and jump out to escape, but he was shot in the process. While there's some dispute about the specifics, with some people saying Smith was dead when he hit the ground, while others saying he was alive and the mob picked him up, propped him against a wall, and he was killed by a firing squad. What was not disputed was that Joseph Smith was now dead. Two other Mormon leaders were able to escape that day, and there was a conflict over who would take over the leadership of the church. Joseph Smith's likely chosen successor would have been his brother Hiram, but Hiram was also killed with him in Illinois. As Brigham would say, did Joseph ordain any man to take his place? He did. Who was it? It was Hiram. But Hiram fell a martyr before Joseph did. If Hiram had lived, he would have acted for Joseph. Oliver Cowdery, who'd worked with Smith since the very beginning, helping to write the Book of Mormon, was an obvious candidate as well, except for the fact that he had been excommunicated from the church in 1838 after having a falling out with Smith, likely of a plural marriage. Sidney Rigdon actively campaigned for the role, but in the end, the Council of 12 chose to be their leader, Brigham Young. In January of 1845, the state of Illinois revoked the Nauvoo Charter, meaning the Mormon-run courts, police, and militia no longer had legal standing. Allegations that the Mormon Church had engaged in counterfeiting operations, as well as just ongoing dangers from mob violence of anti-Mormon sentiment generally, made staying in Nauvoo untenable. Young and church leaders looked west, beyond the current borders of the United States, for a place where no other settlers had yet colonized, where they could have the peace that they had not been able to find in any of the previous stops. They chose a location just outside of the then U.S. borders in Mexico, in the Salt Lake Valley. Although the Salt Lake Valley was on the Western Trail of California, few, if any, Western settlers had decided to stop there. Even Native American tribes generally avoided the areas. The Goshoot did go there seasonally, but they described the lake as, quote, bad water. Young's first organized group of followers to relocate first went to Winter Quarters, Nebraska in 1846 in order to prepare and supply for the long journey. After wintering in Nebraska, the party followed the exact same path that the ill-fated Donner Party had the year before when attempting to reach California, only stopping in Salt Lake City on July 24, 1847, rather than continuing on. Between the time the Mormons had decided to leave Illinois to go to Nebraska and eventually arrive in Salt Lake, the Mexican-American War had broken out. At the time they arrived, the land around the Salt Lake area was likely controlled by the United States rather than Mexico, although the war hadn't officially resolved. But there didn't seem to be a great deal of concern who controlled a giant salt lake in the desert surrounded by mountains. Young declared the area the City of the Great Salt Lake, and he traveled back and forth several times between Winter Quarters and Salt Lake to assist those who had come to be known as the Mormon pioneers coming west. By December, more than 2,000 Mormon settlers had arrived, a quarter of them children under the age of 8. In December of 1847, Young officially became the second president of the Church of Latter-day Saints, following in Joseph Smith's tradition. He attempted to reestablish the theodemocracy that Joseph Smith had described, and he and his followers believed that this was a promised land for them. Young openly embraced polygamy, arguing it was needed to populate the new land. He said of the practice, quote, "But the first wife will say, 'It is hard, for I have lived with my husband 20 years, or 30, and I have raised a family of children for him, and it is a great trial to me for him to have more women. Then I say it is time you gave him up to other women who will bear children.'" Young personally had at least 56 wives, although not all of them were conjugal. From those that he had at least 57 children from at least 16 separate women. As part of the Compromise of 1850, Utah was granted territorial status, but denied statehood. Still, Young was named territorial governor by then President Millard Fillmore. But this declaration didn't mean those native to the area always agreed. Border and land disputes were a constant problem with Native American groups. Native American groups were known to take cattle, often when it wandered from Mormon-controlled areas. The first major conflict came when a group known as the Timpanogos were questioned by Mormon militia leaders about missing cattle. Mormon leaders met with a tribal leader that they called Little Chief, who indicated that there was 2 specific members of his tribe who were engaged in this behavior, and that he understood if they had to act against those 2 members. On March 1st, a group of 50 militiamen went into the Utah Valley south of Salt Lake City to investigate a supposed horse theft from Brigham Young's personal herd. Young's orders were to, quote, "to take such measures as will put final end to their depredation in the future." The following morning, the group received word, quote, stating that as the horses were not stolen, we need not spend any more time in search of them, but proceeded with the Indians for killing cattle as had been directed, so that the nature of our expedition was not in the least changed. They continued on, and on March 3rd, they came on Little Chief's encampment and demanded to be shown where the cattle thieves' encampment was. Little Chief gave them information as to where the encampment was, expecting them to only go specifically against the 2 thieves. But instead, the militia ambushed the entire group, killing between 4 and 7 men, most of whom were innocent of any charges, and enraging the Timpanogos. On March 10th, the expedition returned, indicating the land in that area was of very high quality. As a result, Brigham Young called for 30 families to move to the area. These settlers built a stockade fortification and armed it with a 12-pound cannon. The increased interaction with settlers meant the Timpanogos began catching diseases they had never before seen and dying in large numbers. A Timpanogos man that the Mormons referred to as Old Bishop came into conflict with a group of Mormons and was murdered by them. This further increased tensions, and the settlers wrote back to Brigham Young asking for additional assistance, but not giving the context that it was caused by the murder. Young wrote back that he would send assistance, and also added that he didn't think they should have treaties with the natives as equals, as much as they should, quote, have dominion over them. The Mormon militia, known as the Nauvoo Legion, was sent from Salt Lake City to attack the Timpanogos village in February of 1850 during the dead of winter. They killed at least 100 directly, with many others left to die of exposure with their settlements destroyed. Of the 100 that were killed, around 50 were decapitated, ostensibly for scientific research, However, in practice, those heads were displayed as a warning to the prisoners who were taken. Those prisoners would then become slaves, quote, for the purpose of weaning them from their savage pursuits and bringing them up to the habits of civilized and Christian life. The settlement in this area was initially named Battle Creek after the incident, but is now known as Pleasant Grove. It didn't seem the federal government was particularly bothered by the massacre, but the taking of slaves were a problem. Utah's laws on slavery and polygamy were very likely the reason their second application for statehood was rejected in 1852. Joseph Smith himself had an ever-changing view on slavery. In the early days of the church, Joseph Smith asserted that, quote, the seed of Cain were black, and argued the dark skin was linked to being descended from Cain, who in the Bible had killed his brother. This led to what was called the curse of Ham. Later in his life, in 1844 during his presidential campaign, Smith called for a gradual end to slavery by 1850, with the government buying the freedom of enslaved people using the money from the sale of public lands. But Brigham Young did not share Smith's change of heart on slavery. He argued it was, quote, a divine institution because of the curse of Ham and the mark of Cain. As governor, he legalized Native American slavery, and aside from those captured, approximately 400 Native American children were purchased within the first decade to the settlement of Salt Lake City. And although Brigham Young was the federally appointed governor of Utah, it was very clear early on that the law of the federal government came secondary to the law of the church. President Millard Fillmore appointed 3 non-Mormons who arrived in the summer of 1851. But within just a few months, they left Utah and never returned, reporting fearing for their safety. A federal judge named William W. Drummond was appointed as an associate justice to the Utah Territory Supreme Court in 1855. He resigned just 2 years later after reporting the people of Utah ignored the laws of Congress when only acknowledged the laws of the church. In fairness, Drummond's specific resignation may have had as much to do with his allegedly having a prostitute sit on the bench with him as any issues with the church itself. Brigham Young wrote of Drummond that he, quote, transcended his authority and demeaned himself very much like a dog or wolf, vicious and brutal, whining and snappish, vain as a peacock and ignorant as a jackass. But the judge's resignation letter was widely circulated, and combined with the other resignations, President James Buchanan felt compelled to act. In 1857, Buchanan announced he was replacing Brigham Young as governor. He named Alfred Cumming as his replacement and ordered that 2,500 federal troops be sent to the Utah Territory to build an outpost to act to support the newly appointed governor. These troops were specifically ordered to not act aggressively and to only enforce the laws at the discretion of the new governor. However, the arrival of these troops was somewhat delayed by the outbreak of violence in Kansas over slavery, which came to be known as Bleeding Kansas. And given Mormon history in Missouri and Illinois, the Mormons were very fearful of what the federal troops would actually do when they arrived. So concerned were they about the federal troops, they actually entered into many alliances with Native Americans in the area, finding common cause against the federal government. Young also formally activated the Nauvoo region, calling all able-bodied men between the ages of 15 and 60 to be ready to defend themselves and the state. Some became distrustful of any non-Mormons coming from the east. When a large wagon train of families making their way west from Arkansas stopped in Salt Lake City to resupply before heading southwest toward California on what was called the Mormon Road, because of the paranoia around federal troops, a group of Mormon militias working with Native Americans in southern Utah made plans to ambush them. The Mormon militia mixed with and disguised themselves as members of the Paiute tribe. On September 7th, the wagon was attacked, and for 5 days the wagon train members were able to hold off the attackers. But during this time, 7 members of the wagon train were killed and 16 others wounded. On September 11th, 2 Mormon militiamen approached the wagon waving white flags and told them they would escort the group to a nearby city in exchange for all of their livestock and supplies, claiming they would be given to the Paiute Native Americans who would attack them. But the Mormons feared the settlers would recognize the white men in disguise and turn them in if they made it to nearby settlements. Once the wagons had surrendered, the men, women, and children were separated, and the men were sent with a militia unit who, on signal, turned and executed them. Shortly after, the women and children who had been separated were then ambushed by another militia hiding nearby. Only children who were deemed too young to understand what had happened were allowed to survive, and they were taken prisoner to be given to Mormon families. Of the 120 people in the wagon train, only 17 were allowed to live. But at least one of the 17 survivors did remember. They gave a statement in 1875 where she said, "At the close of the massacre, there were 18 children still alive. One girl, some 10 or 12 years old, they said was too big and could tell, and so they killed her, leaving only 17. Brigham Young's government supposedly conducted an investigation into the wagon train massacre, blaming the entire incident on Native Americans, but a federal inquiry later proved this was not true. When the children were eventually located, the captain who found them said they were, quote, in a most wretched condition, half starved, half naked, filthy, infested with vermin, and their eyes diseased from the cruel neglect to which they had been exposed. On September 15th, Brigham Young declared martial law, preventing, quote, all armed forces of every description from coming into this territory under any pretense whatsoever. The Nauvoo Legion first made contact with the U.S. Army moving into Utah at the end of September and engaged in tactics to slow the Army's movement. Mormon militia would burn grass along the trail to scare the cattle the Army had brought into stampeding. By October, they had burned down a fort to prevent the Army from using it and destroyed supply trains behind the forces, attacking over 50 supply wagons that were supporting the federal troops. All of this forced the troops to delay moving into Salt Lake City until at least the following spring. Throughout the winter of 1857, between 1,200 and 2,000 Mormon militiamen built fortifications in Echo Canyon and Weber Canyon to protect the access to the population centers in northern Utah, and they stayed there throughout the entire winter. Young proposed and began to implement a scorched earth plan for the spring of 1858, where if the federal troops tried to occupy the Salt Lake City area, the entire community would move south and they would burn the city and the surroundings to the ground as they left. Before fighting could come to a head, Congress made clear they did not support a war with Utah. Buchanan agreed to a truce in April of 1857, which included a full pardon for Brigham Young, but still installed Cumming as the governor. Cumming remained governor until 1861 at the start of the Civil War, when he was replaced by John W. Dawson. Dawson's term lasted only 3 weeks. The first problem he had was on arrival, he asked for assistance in raising army for the Civil War. Brigham Young reportedly responded to his request by saying, quote, he would see them in hell before I'll raise an army for them. Dawson was also accused of making, quote, grossly improper proposals to a Mormon widow who reportedly chased him from her home with a shovel. According to Dawson, quote, I was followed by a band of Danites and 12 miles out wantonly assaulted and beaten. He went on to say that the group, quote, began and continued a most serious violence to me, wounding my head badly in many places, kicking me in the loins and right breast until I was exhausted. Some reports say that he was partially castrated. Dawson fled Utah as a result. Federal troops had largely left Utah territory to fight in the Civil War, which left the Mormon Church more or less in full control of the territory until the next governor arrived in July of 1862. Because of what happened with Dawson, Abraham Lincoln decided that even in the midst of the Civil War, federal troops were still needed in Utah, both because of the local control issues and as well as the need to protect newly built telegraph lines and routes to California. Patrick E. Connor was ordered to lead a regiment of soldiers from California into Utah and to build an outpost 3 miles outside of Salt Lake City. Connor was unhappy that his men were stationed so far from the war in the east. He wrote that he and his men joined to, quote, serve their country in shooting traitors instead of eating rations and freezing to death around sagebrush fires. Connor understood a large part of his job was to suppress any possible Mormon uprising, and the U.S. Army was unsympathetic to the Mormons given the events of the years prior. He went out of his way to protect non-Mormons specifically, and for those wishing to leave the Mormon Church. He and his troops also made discoveries of mineable mineral deposits in the area, and his reporting this to Washington led to a start of an influx of non-Mormon immigrants coming to the area to cash in on this. Meanwhile, the Native American population across the West continued to struggle due to the incursion of white settlers. In 1859, the superintendent for Indian Affairs for the Utah Territory wrote, quote, the Indians have become impoverished by the introduction of white population. By 1862, his successor wrote, the Indians have been in great numbers in a starving and destitute condition. No provisions have been made for them, either as to clothing or provisions by my predecessors. The Indians' condition was such, with the prospect they would rob mail stations to sustain life. Connor was equally unsympathetic to them. In December of 1862, Connor sent a detachment to investigate reports of stolen livestock. This livestock was reportedly taken by members of the Shoshone Nation in northern Utah, the same nation from which Sacagawea came before assisting Lewis and Clark's expedition in the early 1800s. On hearing that members of the federal army were coming, most of the Shoshone in the area fled. 4 Shoshone men who, by most accounts, had nothing to do with the thefts were captured by the army. The leaders of the detachment ordered that the men would be executed if the horses weren't returned by noon the following day. Shoshone leaders continued their retreat, and the men were killed and their bodies dumped into the river. Soon after, a freight hauling service was attacked by the Shoshone, and 2 men were killed. A survivor told newspapers the Shoshones were, quote, determined to avenge the blood of their comrades. He went on to say that they, quote, intended to kill every white man they should meet on the north side of the Bear River till they should be fully avenged. When a group of miners were attacked after making a wrong turn near a Shoshone encampment, Connor decided to act. He marched his men 120 miles north in the dead of winter and gave the order to, quote, destroy every male Indian whom you may encounter. The Shoshone were warned ahead of time and set up defenses. They even attempted to negotiate an alliance with local Mormons, whom they had historically been able to get along with and had relatively good relations with, but the Mormons weren't interested in their fight. A newspaper account stated the leader of the Shoshone, a man by the name of Sagwitch, went to Salt Lake City to ask for help from Brigham Young. Quote, the prophet had told Sagwitch the Mormon people had suffered enough from the Shoshone of the Cache Valley, and if more blood were spilled, the Mormons might just pitch in and help the troops. The Shoshone seemed to expect the encounter to be similar to those in the past, where a standoff would occur and a treaty would be negotiated. But Connor had no interest in negotiations. Just before the first shots were fired, reportedly Sagwitch saw the army coming and said, quote, looks like there's something up on the ridge there. Look like a cloud. Maybe it is a steam come from a horse. Maybe that's them soldiers they were talking about. The Shoshone put up a strong initial stand, but after a few hours they were out of ammunition and a massacre ensued. Connor's forces reportedly suffered 14 deaths and 49 wounded, but he estimated killing more than 200 to 300 of the Shoshone warriors, with one count putting the numbers at 493. This was effectively the end of the Shoshone Nation in Utah. Some Shoshone survivors, including Sagwitch himself, joined Mormon settlements in the area. Sagwitch was not only baptized in the Mormon church, but ordained as an elder. Other survivors fled to Idaho and Wyoming, leaving little, if any, resistance in northern Utah. As the Civil War came to an end in 1865, in southern Utah, separate conflicts with other Native American groups escalated. Native American members of the Ute tribe were dying of diseases such as smallpox now that they were in regular contact with Europeans. Brigham Young personally became involved in negotiations, but as Young was no longer governor, these treaties had no federal backing, and conflicts continued to escalate into what has become known as the Black Hawk War. Black Hawk was the name Brigham Young gave to one of the leaders of the Ute Nation. After a string of isolated killings of white settlers during cattle raids, Mormon militia was called to end the raids. This militia came upon a camp. The 100 militiamen fought with 13 men and boys for approximately 4 hours, killing 10 with 2 escaping and 1 being captured, along with several women and children. When one of the women attempted to resist with a knife, she was shot and a panic ensued, leading the militia to open firing on all the remaining women and children, killing them all. This event further enraged Native Americans in the area, and Mormons feared retaliation. In Circleville, church officials ordered that a group of Native Americans belonging to the Paiute Nation be disarmed, despite them showing no inclination to join the hostilities and having up to that point friendly interactions with the town. This group consisted of only 27 people in total. When the townsfolk approached and surrounded the Paiutes, all but one agreed to be arrested peacefully. The one who refused was shot and killed on the spot. Later, 2 attempted to escape and were shot by guards, and as a result, the rest were moved to a secured cellar. After a town meeting, 21 of the 24, including women and children, were killed by having their throats slit. Only 2 young boys and 1 girl were able to escape. They were found hiding nearby, and the young girl was killed. One of the boys was captured and sold into slavery for a horse and a bushel of wheat. The fate of the last boy has been lost to history. This also enraged Native Americans locally. The Utes were joined by some refugee recruits from the Navajo Nation who had been driven off their land in New Mexico, growing the Native American forces resisting the Mormon militias, and organizing more cattle raids, including the killing of white settlers. Mormons abandoned many smaller towns and built fortifications around larger ones. Over time, the Native American resistors realized that they could not win. When Black Hawk was wounded, in 1867 peace talks began. Black Hawk died in 1870 of tuberculosis, and it wasn't until federal troops came to the area in 1872 that the conflict really came to a final end, with the last settler casualty in September of 1872. At that point, the Utes were more or less forced onto reservations. In that same year of 1872, Utah again applied for statehood, with a new constitution that gave women the right to vote. Utah itself had around 86,000 people, despite much of the Utah territory being ceded to a newly created state of Nevada. This was well above the number required for statehood. But other issues, most notably the issue of polygamy, still gave Congress pause as to admission. In 1877, Brigham Young died, and the leadership of the church shifted to John Taylor. Taylor had been with Joseph Smith in Carthage, Illinois when the mob had killed him, but had managed to escape. He was also a polygamist, having at least 7 wives and fathering an estimated 34 children. In 1882, Congress made polygamy a felony federal offense. After the law passed, Taylor moved in with his sister at a home owned by the church to avoid prosecution and to not show favoritism to any of his families. That same year, Utah once again applied for statehood. In the past, they had asked for a state by the name of Deseret, the name of the intended separate nation for the Mormon church, but now asked for it instead to be called Utah. Still, once again, Congress denied them admission. In 1885, Taylor and other high-ranking members of the church were forced to go into semi-hiding because of the polygamy laws. Taylor said, quote, "I would like to obey and place myself in subjugation of every law of man. What then? Am I to disobey the law of God? Has any man right to control my conscience or your conscience? No man has a right to do it." But the federal position against polygamy only hardened over time. President Grover Cleveland said in his annual address to Congress, quote, "The strength, the perpetuity, and the destiny of the nation rest upon our homes, established by the law of God, guarded by parental care, regulated by parental authority, and sanctified by parental love. These are not the homes of polygamy. There is no feature of this practice, or the system which sanctions it, which is not opposed to all that is of value in our institutions." In 1887, the Edmunds-Tucker Act, which focused on adding restrictions to the Church of Latter-day Saints, passed into law. Among a number of other provisions, it disincorporated the Mormon Church, allocating that the assets be used for public schools in the territory. It required an anti-polygamy oath for prospective voters, jurors, and public officials, dismantled the Nauvoo Legion, and removed spousal privileges to not testify for polygamists. It also removed a woman's right to vote. Taylor died in 1887 and was replaced by Wilford Woodruff. That same year, Utah once again changed their constitution in an effort to gain statehood, this time including anti-polygamy provisions to appease Congress. On May 19, 1890, the Supreme Court ruled in the late Corporation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints versus the United States that the federal government could in fact seize church assets because of the church position on polygamy, and over $300,000 in assets were taken as a result. Before any physical property of the church could be seized, in September of 1890, Woodruff issued a manifesto which denounced polygamy, despite Woodruff himself being a polygamist. As a result, the government ceased seizure. Some church leaders left the church, going to places like Mexico and Canada, where they'd be able to continue practicing plural marriage, but this manifesto became generally accepted by the mainstream Mormon church. On October 25, 1893, a congressional resolution authorized the release of assets seized in the LDS church because, quote, "said church has discontinued the practice of polygamy and no longer encourages or gives countenance to any manner of practices in violation of law or contrary to the good morals of public policy." On January 4th, 1896, Utah was admitted as a state. History is awkward.